When the walls of a great city like Samarkand or Baghdad finally fell to Mongol siegecraft, the terror was just beginning. For the men, the sorting was often brutally simple. Artisans to one side, soldiers for execution, and the able-bodied for forced levies. But for the women, a different, more complex, and in many ways more terrifying, calculus was applied. Their fate was not a uniform sentence of death or slavery. It was a cold, legal classification based on their blood, their skills, and their political value. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together of the Mongol Empire. The Mongol court, the Ordu, is often imagined as a chaotic, windswept camp of warriors. This is a profound mistake. The Ordu was a mobile imperial city, a vast, complex organism that served as the political, administrative, and domestic heart of the empire. And this entire organism was powered almost exclusively by the labor of captured women. To understand the empire, we must first understand the legal and social machinery that populated these mobile capitals. When a city resisted and was conquered, the Yasa, the Mongol legal code, was invoked. The population, having forfeited their right to life, became property. This is the moment of the Great Sorting, a scene described with chilling bureaucratic detachment by chroniclers like Giovanni. Here, the fates of women were decided in an instant. First, and in the greatest numbers, were the common women, the wives and daughters of merchants, soldiers, farmers, and laborers. By the law of the Yasa, they were declared boghole. This is a term we must analyze with precision. It means chattel. It means property, on par with a horse or a roll of silk. Their legal personhood was extinguished. They were inventoried and distributed as spoils of war, with a portion going to the Great Khan, and the rest divided among the Noyan, the nobility, and the common soldiers. For these women, their integration into the Ordu was an integration into a life of absolute servitude. They became the unseen, unrecorded domestic engine of the Mongol war machine. They were the lower-ranking concubines, the cooks, the cleaners, the yurt assemblers, the wet nurses, the felt makers, and the herders. Their sexual availability to their masters was not a question. It was an assumed function of their status as property. When a soldier died, his female slaves were simply inherited by his son or brother, like the rest of his gear. This was the fate of the vast, anonymous majority. But there was another, entirely distinct category of captive. These were the high-status women, the wives, daughters, and sisters of the defeated Khan, Sultan, or King. These women were not thrown into the common pool of boghole. They were high-value political assets, and they were treated as such. They were seized, guarded, and reserved for the Great Khan or the commanding general himself. Their fate was not domestic anonymity. It was a calculated political and forced absorption. When we consult the secret history of the Mongols, the foundational epic of the empire, we see this pattern established by Genghis Khan himself. When he defeated his rivals on the steppe, like the Kerit or the Naiman, he systematically took their high-born wives and daughters and redistributed them. He would install one as a junior wife in his own Ordu, solidifying his claim to his rival's legitimacy. He would give another to a loyal Noyan as a high-status wife, a political reward that bound that general ever closer to him. This was not marriage as we understand it. It was a transfer of dynastic property. By taking the elite women of a conquered people, the Mongols were severing the head of the old dynasty and grafting its legitimacy onto their own. The children from these forced unions, born into the Mongol elite, would carry the blood of both the conqueror and the conquered, a living symbol of the new political reality. Thus, the Ordu became a complex, deeply stratified society of women. At the top were the great Khatuns, the senior wives of the Khan, who wielded immense personal power. Below them were the junior wives and high-status concubines, many of them captured royalty, navigating a precarious world of political intrigue. And supporting this entire structure, forming its vast, unfree base, were the thousands of bog-hole women whose identities were erased and whose labor made the entire imperial enterprise possible. The integration of these two classes of women was, therefore, a story of two different, though equally unfree, realities. For the bog-hole, it was a fall into the anonymity of chattel slavery. For the captured elite, it was a forced entry into the very highest levels of the Mongol power structure, a gilded cage where they served as political trophies and as mothers to a new generation of imperial rulers. Their presence in the Ordu was not an accident. It was a deliberate strategy of state building. The Mongol Ordu was not a mere camp. We must erase the image of a few scattered tents and replace it with the reality: a mobile metropolis, a sprawling city of felt and wood that could cover square miles. The personal Ordu of a great Khan or a powerful Khatun, queen, might consist of thousands of yurts, tens of thousands of people, and vast herds of animals. This city had to be fed, clothed, housed, and, most critically, it had to move. The logistical miracle of the Mongol Empire was not just its cavalry. It was the fact that its imperial capital could be packed onto carts, transported hundreds of miles, and be fully functional within hours of arrival. This entire miracle was performed by a captured female workforce. Their labor was the hidden engine of the court. When we analyze the function of the thousands of bog-hole women absorbed into this system, we find they were not just domestic servants. They were the state's primary logistical core. Let us deconstruct this hidden labor, moving from the foundational to the specialized. The most fundamental task was providing shelter. The Mongol yurt, or GER, is a marvel of engineering, but it is heavy, complex, and requires constant maintenance. It was exclusively the women's job to disassemble, transport, and reassemble these structures. The Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, who visited the Ordu of Munka Khan in 1253, provides an invaluable first-hand account. He describes with awe the enormous carts, 22 feet wide, pulled by teams of oxen that carried the largest jurs of the elite. And he specifies that it was the women who drove these carts, who managed the vast baggage train, who were responsible for this colossal feat of haulage. For the thousands of smaller yurts, the process was a daily, back-breaking drill. The felt coverings had to be stripped, the wooden latticework folded, and everything loaded in a precise order. Upon arrival, the process was reversed. This was not housework. This was the continuous, coordinated assembly and disassembly of an entire city, performed by unfree labor in all weather on unforgiving terrain. Then there was the production of the shelter itself. The jurs were covered in thick, water-resistant felt, and felt making is a grueling, communal, and unending task. The bog hall women were responsible for shearing the sheep, beating the wool with rods, wetting it, and then rolling the matted fibers, often by dragging the heavy bundles behind horses. This was, in effect, a mobile factory for the production of housing materials, staffed entirely by slaves. Second, the Ordu had to be fed. The Mongol elite subsisted on a diet rich in meat and dairy. The male warriors might conduct great hunts, but the daily processing of this food was, again, female labor. It was the bog hall women who milked the vast herds of mares, cows, and goats, often in the pre-dawn cold. It was they who performed the arduous task of churning the milk, most importantly, to produce arog, fermented mare's milk, the mildly alcoholic staple that was consumed in enormous quantities. They were the butchers, the cooks, the preparers of borts, dried meat, that provisioned the armies. They were also the foragers, responsible for scouring the landscape for edible roots, berries, and, most critically, fuel. In the vast, treeless steppe, the only fuel was argol, dried animal dung. Armies of captive women and children would spend their days gathering this essential resource to heat the yurts and cook the food. When we analyze this, we see a clear system. The male sphere was war, hunt, and high politics. The female sphere, powered by the bog hall, was everything else. It was the domestic economy, the food processing industry, the textile manufactory, and the transport corps, all fused into one. Beyond this foundational labor, we find the artisanal production. This is where the Haztan, or captured artisan women, were put to work, often alongside bog hall, who showed aptitude. They were segregated into workshops within the Ordu. Here, they were weavers, creating the stunning silks, brocades, and carpets that decorated the elite yurts and served as diplomatic gifts. They were embroiderers, tanners, and leather workers. This last role, leather working, directly connects this hidden female labor to the Mongol war machine. While a male smith might forge the arrowheads, it was often the captive women who were curing the hides, stitching the quivers, making the bowstrings, and braiding the leather ties and harnesses essential for the horses and the lamellar armor of the soldiers. The Mongol warrior rode into battle quite literally bound by the products of this female slave economy. The chroniclers of the age, men like Rashid al-Din or Juvaini, rarely, if ever, mention this. They wrote for their masters, the Khans and Noyan. Their histories are concerned with dynastic succession, battlefield victories, and the grand pronouncements of rulers. They do not see the bog hall women gathering argol or stitching a boot. This labor is hidden from the official record precisely because it was ubiquitous, constant, and performed by those who had been legally rendered invisible. We only see this workforce through the accounts of outsiders like Rubruk, or by inference. The Ordus worked. The armies were supplied. The Khans were fabulously wealthy in textiles and goods. This wealth and this logistical success did not emerge from a vacuum. It was extracted, day after day, from this massive, unfree, and almost exclusively female workforce. This was their economic function. They were not just concubines in the modern sense. That word implies a primary focus on sexual service. While that was an ever-present and non-negotiable part of their servitude, their primary value to the Mongol state, in the aggregate, was their labor. They were the human engines that made the mobile empire possible, an invisible, permanent underclass whose unceasing work formed the floor and walls of the imperial court. Their domestic labor was, in fact, the state's most essential industry. But within this vast collective, a select few, the high-status captives, were destined for an entirely different and far more precarious form of service. But while the bog-hole woman's existence was one of crushing, anonymous labor, her fate was, in a dark way, predictable. She was an invisible cog in the logistical machine. For the other class of captive, the high-status woman, the captured princess or noblewoman, a terrifyingly different life awaited. She was not invisible. In fact, her labor was to be seen. She was now a political pawn in the most dangerous game in the empire, the high-stakes, blood-soaked politics of the imperial tent. When we analyze the function of these elite captives, we must understand their precarious legal and social standing. They were not bog-hole, chattel, but they were emphatically not khatuns, senior wives. The great khatuns, like Genghis Khan's wife Burta, were political forces in their own right. They commanded their own Ordus, held vast personal wealth, and had a powerful voice in the Kurultai, the great assembly that elected a new Khan. The captive noblewoman entered this world as a trophy. She was a living symbol of the Khan's victory, a constant reminder to her own conquered people that their former dynasty was now subservient. Her primary function was to serve the Khan as a junior wife or high-ranking concubine, and her labor was entirely political, psychological, and relational. Her first task was simple survival. The Ordu was not a harmonious family. It was a nest of vipers. The senior khatuns vied viciously with one another for influence, each promoting the interests of her own sons. These khatuns commanded vast factions, built on alliances with powerful Noyan, generals. The captive concubine, arriving with no power base, was a target. She might be seen as a new favorite of the Khan, drawing the murderous jealousy of a senior wife. She might be used as a pawn, forced into an alliance with one faction, which would make her a mortal enemy of another. Her labor was to navigate this. She had to be a courtier, a spy, and a psychologist. She had to read the shifting tides of favor, to know which Khatun was in ascendance and which Noyan had the Khan's ear. She had to do this with no allies of her own, armed only with her wits and her ability to please a master who held the power of life and death over her. This was not domestic work. This was a 24-hour performance where a single misstep, a word of support for the wrong person, a perceived slight, could lead to her exile or quiet execution. This was her precarious, hidden, and high-stakes political work, to secure her own survival by making herself a useful and non-threatening asset in a world of constant lethal factionalism. She might serve as a channel of information, offering the Khan insight into the politics of her conquered homeland. She might be used as a listener in the Ordu, reporting back on the plots and whispers of her rivals. But there was one, and only one, path from the state of precarious servitude to genuine structural power. Her political labor had a single, ultimate goal: to bear the Khan a son. The moment a captive concubine gave birth to a son, the entire political equation of the Ordu shifted. She was no longer just a trophy. She was now the mother of a prince, a bigi. This child, a recognized scion of the Golden family, had a legal claim to a share of the empire. This single act transformed the captive woman from a political object to a political agent. Her labor now became that of a dynast. She was no longer just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting for her son's inheritance. As the secret history and other chronicles show, when a prince came of age, he was traditionally granted his own ulag, a portion of people and pasture land, and his own Ordu. And who would manage this Ordu on his behalf? His mother. This is the apex of the captive woman's journey. She who had been seized as property, who had labored in a state of terror, could now find herself as the de facto regent of a vast appanage. She would command her own court, control her own resources, and, most importantly, begin the work of building her son's faction. She would scheme, forge alliances with Noyan, and plot to ensure that her son, the child of a captive, would be in the strongest possible position when the old Khan died and the bloody game of succession began. Of course, this was the ultimate gamble. For every high-status captive who successfully navigated this path, like the legendary Sorgagtani Beki, a Karat noble, not a captive, but the template for this role, who maneuvered her sons to become great Khans themselves, countless others failed. If her son was passed over, if her faction was outmaneuvered at the Kuriltai, or if her child was simply assassinated by a rival half-brother, her entire world would be destroyed. She and her household would be purged, exiled, or absorbed into the property of the victor. This was the hidden political labor of the Ordu. It was a brutal meritocracy of survival, where captured women were forced to play the game of thrones with their lives and the lives of their children. Their bodies were the battleground, and their sons were the weapons in the ceaseless, internal struggle for power that defined the Mongol Empire. We look back at the ruins of empires, and we see the monuments of Khans. But the foundations of those monuments, the unseen machinery that ran their courts, was built from the lives of women. From the anonymous, systemic toil of the bog hole to the precarious, high-stakes political gamble of the captive noble, their unfree labor was not an adjunct to the Mongol story. It was the very engine that made it possible, a silent, human cost echoing from the heart of the imperial tent.